these things. Because once again, it did not concern what? A matter of Roman law or anything that he would. Gallio was the most important Roman official that Paul met on his 3 journeys. Gallio was brother to the famous Stoic philosopher Seneca. Now, Seneca, his part in this is important because he's the one who tutored Nero. Now, what's he famous for? Killing Christians, city caught on fire, who do you blame on? Christians. Now, he was tutored by Seneca. Seneca's brother was. Now, Gallio's administration can be fixed because of an inscription found at Delphi, and he began to reign in that position or rule in that position in July of 51 AD. So he had apparently gotten there right before Paul. And so he's in that position. So now this aids us in dating Paul's work at Corinth. From fall of AD 50, spring of AD 52, using the 18 months that's talked about in Acts 18 as the guideline for that. So now as we think about Gallio, he is a very prominent individual, and yet we see where the mindset of the Romans is pretty much throughout that area. As long as you weren't causing disturbances, and as long as you were paying what? Your taxes. The Romans didn't really care what you did. Just don't cause an uproar. Don't cause us problems and pay your taxes. And we're willing to let you do whatever you wish and whatever you desire. So now, following this meeting, Paul is released and he stays a good while. Now, we don't know how long he stayed. We would think it would certainly be within that 18-month time period, could be a little bit more, because there is some indication that Paul's 18 months that he spent there was spent among the Gentiles. So if we confine it to that, then Paul may have been in Corinth a little bit longer. Then notice he took his leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria with Priscilla and Aquila. They were with him. Now, Paul met them where? In Corinth. And he resided with them because they were what I... Now, folks, this is an interesting thought, and I way of explaining it other than the fact this is how it's recorded for us by inspiration. But everywhere you see Priscilla and Aquila, who is mentioned first? She is. If you turn to this passage, or if you go on even to verse 26 of this chapter, if you go to Romans 16:13, if you go to 2 Timothy 4:19, where their names are referenced together, Priscilla is always mentioned first. Anything that we would add other than that is simply in the realm of speculation. But she is always mentioned first. Now, for whatever reason, and we can't go any further than that, this is simply the case. But they were Paul's companions, and they were with him when he left Corinth. And now he's going to cut his hair. He's going to cut his hair off at Cenchrea. Now, just note, if you mark in your Bible, Cenchrea, because in Romans 16 and verse number 1, Paul refers to a very faithful sister in Christ by the name of Phoebe. And notice he says, as he's talking about her and her work, and he says, and the church which is at Cenchrea. So there was apparently, as Paul was traveling with Priscilla and Aquila, and he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow. Now, once again, what kind of vow is this? That's certainly the thought. Now, let me read you something from the Truth for Today commentary, which Brother David Roper wrote. And on this, page 155 of his work. Now, we talk about the Nazirite vow. Who was probably the most famous one to take a Nazirite vow? Samson. Samson. Now, the thing about a Nazirite vow is it was never commanded. Now, one could take the Nazirite vow. Now, once you decided that this is what I'm going to do, then you were bound to all of its stipulations. And how many of them were there? How many stipulations? Well, there were 3. The outward expressions of that vow, which Nazirite means one consecrated or set apart. So you volunteer to set yourself apart or to consecrate yourself. And you can read about the Nazirite vow, number 6. There is probably 18 to 20 verses from the first verse all the way down that are devoted to the Nazirite vow. But the 3 things that had to be followed if you chose to do this was you were to let your hair grow. Number 2, you were to abstain from everything made from grapes. And the third thing is you could not touch a dead body. So these were the 3 stipulations of the Nazirite vow. Now, going ahead and continuing to look at what Brother Roper has to say, he says, for some, the Nazirite vow was lifelong. Hence Samson. Now, who made the determination it would be lifelong? Well, in Samson's case, it was God. Samson was born and God said he'll be a Nazirite all of his life. So now, he was at, but for most, it was for shorter periods. And at the fulfillment of the vow, certain offerings were to be made. So if you decided, okay, I'm going to be a Nazirite for 6 months, then at the end of 6 months, there were certain things you had to do which marked the end of what? My vow. Now let's notice here, the law also specified that the vow maker's hair was to be shaved off in the temple and burned in the fire of the altar. Number 6 and verse 18. Now, by New Testament times, now note this, Jewish tradition allowed for the cutting to be done elsewhere as long as the hair was taken to Jerusalem and the sacrifices were made within 30 days. Now, this comes from the Mishnah Nazir. Now, and the reason being is this allowance was made because of the great number of Jews dispersed. They would have to shave their head when it was completed, and then they would have to get their hair to Jerusalem to be offered and burnt. So now, if you have something like you had Jews living in, for instance, Corinth, and they had taken that vow, well, we're going to see it's 30 days almost from Corinth to Jerusalem. Now, let's notice continuing. Many assume that Paul had taken a short-term Nazirite vow because of thankfulness for God's protection in Corinth. And at the end of the vow coincided with his arrival in Cenchrea. They then assumed that the apostle planned to go to Jerusalem when he reached Palestine to take the shorn locks and make the necessary offerings. Others think it possible that the Nazirite vow also commenced with shaving the head, and that the vow in chapter 18 was taken in Cenchrea as part of a petition for a safe journey. Now, some even suggest that the vow mentioned in Acts 18 was completed in Acts 21. But what's the problem with that? In Acts 21, it wasn't Paul who had taken the vow. It was 4 men who had taken the vow. So that doesn't seem like a very plausible argument to me. But I think this may be part of the greatest thoughts that maybe Brother Roper comes up with in this context, because he's talking about this whole thought of the Nazirite vow and everything that led up to it and all of that. Now he says in his commentary, glance over the last few paragraphs of his book and note the words could, possible, assume, and suggest. The proliferation of such words underlined the fact that Luke did not give us sufficient information to know for certain what Paul did at Cenchrea and why he did it. This is all what? Speculation. Yes, Lee?
I mean, because now he's taking this vow, and on the first day of the week, either he's got to keep his vow and not partake of the Lord's Supper, or he partakes of it and the vow ends.
Right.
But he's got 30 days to get to Jerusalem.
Right. Yeah. So, once again, we're left in the realm of what? Not knowing. Whatever the vow was, I tell you what, you just all dedicate yourself to go to heaven. When you get there, you can ask Paul himself. What's that vow you took in Acts 18? It has been bothering me all my life. So, we don't know. Now, it's interesting, if he did take the Nazirite vow and if he did shave his head, then he had 30 days to get to Jerusalem, if that be the case. And that might help explain why he couldn't stay in Ephesus. I've got to go. I've got to get there. Now, once again, this is all speculation, but I just thought I would just put that out there for you to chew on. And, and we don't have a clear understanding of this picture. And so, in that case, we are not dogmatic about what? Any of it. Yes, Brother Eric?
We don't know what the details are on that vow, but we do know Paul kept it.
Yes.
And that's the most important thing.
Right.
Whatever he did, whatever he said he might do, he did it.
Right.
I think that's a lesson for us.
And we're even assuming it's a Nazirite vow. It might not have been. It may have been some other vow that he made, and it might have been a vow where he said, I'm going to shave my head as an outside or a distinction or declaration of I'm making this vow. Okay? So that could very well be, but I just thought it would be interesting to just sort of bring that all out. Because like I said, Samson's the most famous case of the one taking a Nazirite vow. And yet Samson was anything but a teetotaler. I mean, he was a carouser, a boozer, and everything else during his lifetime. So he might have taken the vow, but he certainly didn't live up to it every day of his life. All right, so now he comes to Ephesus, and he left them there. Who did he leave in Ephesus? Okay, he left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. Now, there's some thought, once again, we're in the realm of what? Speculation. But there's some thought that when he left them there and he went to the synagogue, that he left Priscilla and Aquila, and they were trying to find a sufficient place for them to carry on what? Their occupation, their tent making business. So while he left them there and they went to find some realty to continue their tent making, Paul went to the synagogue. Now, we know that was Paul's custom. And so he had traveled to the synagogue, and there he reasoned with the Jews. Now, we think about Priscilla and Aquila and the fact that they needed a business and that they had a business. They needed a place to continue that business. And they're going to stay in Ephesus for a sufficient amount of time. This wasn't a deal for them. I mean, they were Christians and they were missionary minded, but they were also folks that weren't going to be following Paul everywhere he went. They were going to establish a camp there, and they were going to set up their shop there, we would say. And from there, they were going to carry on the work of preaching and teaching that Jesus is the Christ. Now, when they asked him to stay a longer time with them, the folks in Ephesus, he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing. And he sailed from Ephesus. So Paul is going to leave them, and he's going to travel on and come to Ephesus, and then going to set sail, and he's going to land at Caesarea. And from Caesarea, he went up, indicating what? He went up where? To Jerusalem. And then he went down to Antioch. So he landed at Caesarea, went up to Jerusalem. When he got to Jerusalem, he greeted the church. And then from there, he went down to Antioch, because Antioch was what? Home base. That was his home base. So now we find Paul, and he has ended this 3-year journey on the second missionary journey. And as we find in Acts 14 and verse 27, as he came back off the first missionary journey, he rehearsed and recounted, retold everything that had taken place to the church at Antioch. And why is that proper? Why is that proper? Yeah. If we were to use today's vernacular, it was Antioch who oversaw Paul's missionary work. And, you know, the only missionary that I is whom? Larry Fryer. And every time Larry came back from Sri Lanka, we always got a what? A report of everything that had happened in the time he'd been over there. Now, we weren't his overseeing congregation. That was the church in Milan, Tennessee. But he and Esime worked here with us, and we did help support that work. And but we weren't the overseers. But he gave us a report, so we got kept aware of everything that was taking place in the island of Sri Lanka. Brethren, I can see that being what happened here. Because when you look at verse 23, now after he had spent some time there, now just think in your mind, Larry would be returning. He would be here. And you know, there would be some days where he would have to get reacclimated. Time, diet, everything would have to get reacclimated. And so then he would have that time of recuperating perhaps, or recovering perhaps, if you want to use it in that idea and phrase. And so now then here he would come back and then immediately work here. And that would take on many different facets of the work here. And so he would get involved. Well, I can see where Paul would do the very same thing. He greeted the church in Jerusalem. He went back to Antioch. And after he had spent some time there, now he's going to launch the third missionary journey. And that's what verse 23 is going to be describing for us. Now, notice, after he had spent some time there, he departed, went over the region of Galilee, where he had been how many years earlier? 3 years earlier. And he's strengthening them, and he's encouraging them, and he's finding out how the disciples are doing, how they are growing in their faith. And so now we don't really pick up that third missionary journey until we open Acts chapter 19. It's launched in 1823, but we don't really pick it up until 19 verse 1, because the latter part of chapter 18 is devoted to what individual? Apollos. Now, what do you know about Apollos? Yes, he was. He was very, very, very religious, a very spiritual man. What else? All he knew was John's baptism. Absolutely. What else? He was a Jew. He was a Jew who had been apparently reared or at least educated where? Alexandria, Egypt. Apollos was the one we read about in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. I planted, watered, God gave the increase. And go, if you will, to 1 Corinthians 16. Verse 12. Now concerning our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to come to you with the brethren, willing to come at this time. However, he will come when he has a convenient time. So now, here we have Apollos. And we want to think about Apollos, and not only Apollos, but now who else is instrumental in this section? His famous husband and wife team of Priscilla and Aquila. Now, Paul is left. And now we find in the city of Ephesus, Priscilla and Aquila remained. Now, a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man. An eloquent man could also be translated a very learned man. Alexandria boasted itself, and rightfully so, as being one of the educational centers of the entire world. It had a library in Alexandria that contained over 700,000 copies. But an emphasis in their education was rhetoric, the ability to speak. And not just, okay, I can speak, but we're talking about what? Rhetoric. Persuasive speaking. This is Apollos. Part of Apollos anyway. But as we launch into Apollos, go to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Because now notice, as we brought up, Paul said when he came to the city of Corinth that I did not come to you with excellency of speech or of wisdom. He had tried that where? Keep in mind our trekking across the country. He went to Athens. And then from Athens, he came down to Corinth. And he said, I didn't come to you with excellency of speech. Now, the Athenians, now what are they well known for? They wanted to hear and to tell some new thing. So Paul quoted their poets, he quoted their philosophers, he quoted things that he knew that would be interesting to the Athenians, but perhaps in Paul's mind, and I say perhaps because what do I not know? I don't know exactly this is the case, but perhaps thought when he came to Corinth, I'm not coming to these people and talking about what? Human wisdom, being able to speech and rhetoric. I'm not doing that. But he says, I determined not to know anything except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Now, 1 Corinthians chapter 3. And I, brethren, could not speak to you as to spiritual people, but as to carnal, as to babes in Christ. I have fed you with milk and not with solid food, for until now you were not able to receive it. For even now you are still not able, for you are still carnal. For where there are envy, strife, and divisions among you, are you not carnal and behaving like mere men? For when one says, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, are you not carnal? Now, verse 5. So who then is Paul? Who's Apollos? But ministers by whom you believed, as the Lord gave to each one. I have planted. I misquoted this or cited it a while ago. It's not chapter 2, it's chapter 3. I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God gives the increase. Now he who plants and he who waters are one. There are those who want to claim there was a great conflict between Paul and Apollos. There's not. Who's the one who plants? Who's the one who waters in this context? They're one. They are both one. And each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. Paul said, I have my work to do. Apollos has his work to do. And together, doing our work, we are what? We are one. So now, Apollos is going to become an outstanding evangelist in his own right. If you would go to Titus chapter 3 in verse number 13. Titus 3:13. Now this is Paul, of course, he's writing to Titus. And folks, this is an interesting point. Titus is never mentioned by Luke. But now when I send Artemas to you, or Tychicus, be diligent to come to me to Nicopolis, for I have decided to spend the winter there. Send Zenas the lawyer and Apollos on their journey with diligence, that they may lack nothing. And let our people also learn to maintain good works, to meet urgent needs, that they... Now, we're going to see where in our context here in Acts chapter 18, Apollos is eventually going to wind up very quickly back in Corinth. But he doesn't stay there. He's now sent on his journey. So he becomes an outstanding evangelist, a very prominent evangelist in his own right. But he's an eloquent man. He's mighty in the scriptures, and he came to Ephesus. Now, when he came to Ephesus, where was Paul? Somewhere in that trek from Ephesus back to Antioch, or in the time that he spent in Antioch. So during that time period, Apollos arrives in Ephesus. Now this man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he knew only the baptism of John. So now he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. Now let's just talk about this. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, but he taught accurately the things of the Lord, but he only knew of what? The baptism of John. Now let's think about the things that perhaps Apollos had no knowledge of. John was killed in Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 through 12, as we just look at Matthew's account. Now, John was dead before Jesus ever promised to what? Build his church. Matthew chapter 16, before Jesus ever promised to build the church. So if all Apollos' education was in the teaching of John, then apparently Apollos had no understanding or knowledge whatsoever of what? Another thing that he would be unaware of is before the death of Jesus, long before the death of Jesus, the fact he's going to be resurrected and ascending, before the Great Commission, John was killed long before that, before any of that knowledge was revealed. Therefore, Apollos, if all he knew was what John taught, then he could not be aware of the church, Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. He could not know anything about the ascension, and therefore he could not know anything about the establishment of the church, the coming of the Spirit. He knew nothing of the fulfillment of Jesus' work here on earth. If all he knew was what? John's baptism. Now, was John's baptism important? Yes. He baptized many. And this is one of the things that people always bring up and want to kind of question. And once again, it's kind of a moot point, because the Bible nowhere tells us that anyone who was baptized with John's baptism was ever what? Rebaptized prior to Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. All the apostles, Peter, Andrew, James, John, I'll say maybe not all, but the majority of them were John's disciples first. We never read of them being what? Baptized. Because the baptism of John was unto repentance, and it was for the remission of sin. God or God here Gentile. That's true. And yet, what we do find here now is once Priscilla and Aquila observed what he was teaching, they knew his teaching was what? Inadequate. So now, this is an interesting phrase. So they heard him and they took him aside. I don't normally habitually read from the NIV, but the NIV gives us a strong understanding of what it meant to they took him aside. They invited him to their home. And when they invited him to their home, then folks, what did they do? They taught him the way more accurately. Now notice the first thing they did. They heard him teaching where? In the synagogue. At that moment, they chose to what? Defer, not debate. And they said, you come into our home, took the scriptures, and they showed him and did not tell him. They explained the way unto him more accurately. And now notice, as we think about the activity they've engaged in, then what does that follow? What are the two starting principles of our evangelism program? Defer, don't debate. Show, don't what? Tell. They did exactly what we've been instructed to do. And what was the result of that? And when he desired to cross to Achaia, the brethren wrote exhorting the disciples to receive him. Now, he's in Corinth, and now he's going to, having heard of what's taking place, now he's going to go back to Achaia. Now, folks, what city was in Achaia? Paul had left there. Now, remember in your map, you got this picture. He's crossed back across the land, and now he finds himself in Achaia, and there he's going to find himself in Athens. And he's going to find himself there in the area of Achaia, where those people in that area love to do what? Hear of some new thing. What he did was he took his unique skills and he took them right back into the place who had just left, Paul. And he took those skills, being fully taught what the New Testament teaches, all that he did not know about Jesus. He went back into that city and he used his what? Rhetoric. He used his knowledge of the scriptures. And in that desire, now the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he had arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace. Used publicly, showing from the scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. Now, having been taught the way more accurately, now Paul, or I should say Apollos, now engages in teaching those folks the way of Jesus Christ. All right, thank you all.